is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Fall is upon us, and that means one thing. It's time for our annual back-to-school story ideas. Last week, we shared with you some great advice on the higher ed beat from Mike Vasquez of the Chronicle of Higher Education. This week, it's K-12. And we're joined by Laura Meckler. She is a veteran journalist with the Washington Post, where she covers the news, politics, and people shaping American schools. Laura, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're delighted to have you. I want to jump right in because you've got some great stories on your list. I want to make sure we give them plenty of time. Right at the top is a topic that is familiar to some of our listeners, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's definitely not going away, and that is chronic absenteeism among students. Tell us why that's at the top of your list this fall.
Well, this has been a huge problem since the pandemic. The chronic absenteeism rates were already high, and they just got so much higher during and then in the immediate aftermath of the school shutdowns. So chronic absenteeism is when a student misses 10% or more of the school days in a year, and it could be missing them for any reason. And of course, the concern is if you're not in school, it's pretty hard to learn. And there's a lot of sort of work that's been done in this area that shows that, both reporting as well as more academic work, that shows that, there are a lot of parents who just sort of see the relationship with school differently. In some cases, they have been drummed in their head, if you're not feeling well, don't go to school. So if a kid has the sniffles, maybe they're kept home, or just a general sense that, you can do school from home, or maybe it's not that important to be there. There was just something happened during the pandemic where the mindset shifted. Now, at the same time as that we have these high chronic absentee rates, we also have, continued learning loss from the pandemic, continued test scores that have not rebounded to where they were before the pandemic. So there's a lot of thinking that, these two things go together. So what would I be looking for? Certainly covering a local district would be, what do those local numbers look like? Nationally, we don't have numbers yet from last school year in any significant quantity. We did see a little bit of a rebounding in the 2022-23 school year. So we'll see if that improvement continued in 23-24. My guess is that there may be some improvement, but it's probably not back to where it was before. So I think those are good questions, both nationally and locally, for whether this is improving, what districts are doing to try to address it, is it working, and also the perspective of families that are chronically absent, sort of what's going on with them.
It's interesting for veteran reporters like yourself who've covered chronic absenteeism, which, let's be frank, the numbers weren't fantastic before the pandemic in a lot of places. One of the problems was for younger kids who were missing school, it was almost explicitly with some kind of parental approval, because most parents are not going to leave a 7 or an 8-year-old home alone, or an elementary school is not going to notice and not report to a parent that a kid hasn't shown up for a few days, particularly in the elementary grades. Whereas kids get older, there's sort of a shift a little bit in who's sort of driving that behavior. But now with the pandemic, what we're seeing is sort of this parental acceptance or signing off on it, either, tacitly or explicitly, as you said, because the relationship with school has changed. And I think you're right. I think this is going to be the big story going forward. Even if we see some test numbers rebound, there's been a historic shift here.
Yeah, and I don't think it's one for the better. I think that it will be interesting to see whether schools can recover and get those numbers back. We do see as some states have really put a very big emphasis on this. And generally that looks like, among other things, is tracking it, really carefully tracking it and trying various strategies, just sort of sending a message that this is important. So it'll also be interesting to see, where are the success stories and are there strategies that can be replicated?
That's right. And if you're looking for some of those examples of some of those success stories, there are some nonprofit organizations that are tracking this. One of them is Attendance Works, which does a lot of research in this area. If you go to attendanceworks.org, you can find some of the latest examples of some of the districts. And then those could lead to some good questions for reporters about what's being tried or not, particularly on things like public-private partnerships. And also I've seen some interesting research on apps that are texting messages to parents to remind them, hey, your kid should be in school today.
Yeah, Exactly. Reminders. There's also like a little bit of a conversation. There are some people who are like, this should be punitive. We should be telling them you're in trouble. If you're not here, you're truant. And others who say, no, 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 that's not the way you do it. What you do is you make it much more of a partnership. You say, hey, did you know? Like that kind of thing. Or give them some comparative data. The other kids are in school, yours isn't, that kind of thing, or whatever. There's a lot of different thinking about what may help to change that mindset.
There's another trend story you wanted to talk about, and it's one you've actually written about with a couple of your colleagues at the Washington Post recently, and that is cell phone bans, which are popping up in school systems nationwide. Tell us more about that.
I mean, this thing is so hot right now. We started reporting this story actually in June. We're in a meeting talking about ideas, and someone mentioned this. I was like, let's survey the 20 largest districts and just see what their policies are. And one of the spurs of this idea came from Los Angeles, which they decided in June that they were going to restrict cell phone use in all their schools, which of course is the second largest district in the country. So we're like, all right, let's go take a look. And I swear, over the course of reporting this story, and then they decided to hold it for a little while before to run it a little bit closer to where more kids were going back to school. It just kept more and more. We just kept having to update it with more and more numbers, new districts, new policies, new governors coming out. You have statewide laws in several states saying that school districts have to develop a policy about this. You have other states that are providing funding to help collect cell phones or restrict them during the day. You have governors just sort of calling on states to do it. And you have, of course, at the district level, districts taking this initiative. Our 20 district survey showed that 7 of the 20 had policies not allowing cell phones for use at all during the school day, or they were set to implement those. Another 7 had other restrictive policies that weren't quite that strict. So that's, 14 out of 20. And I'm sure the number has probably gone up since then. So I also hear a lot of conversation about this among parents, just both anecdotally in my own life. I am on a group chat with a bunch of parents from one of my kids' schools. And this just came up the other day organically. The school had decided to implement a sort of modest, what I would consider a modest policy, which is that you're not allowed to have your cell phones out during class, but you are allowed to have them during lunch. And there was immediate conversation in this group chat. Well, why not ban them all day long? So this is being driven by a variety of things, but there's no question in my mind that this is on the rise.
You had a scene actually in your story talking about teachers walking through the cafeteria at lunch and seeing tables of total silence with the heads bent down over their phone screens. And I got to tell you, Ara, that just killed me for a lot of levels. I mean, so much of school, better or worse, is that interpersonal interaction, figuring out who your allies are, figuring out how to get along with other people who aren't your allies, and surviving lunch. I mean, I know it's a rite of passage. I just can't even imagine these silent cafeterias.
Yeah, that actually came from the superintendent of the Los Angeles schools, Unified School District. He told that story of walking into a cafeteria and seeing 4 or 5 kids sitting around a table, not talking to each other, just looking at their phones. And I think, as adults, we can all relate to this. I mean, how many of us have not been at a dinner with friends where somebody's constantly checking their phone? Hopefully we have a little more restraint. We do actually have a conversation, but we all know that this happens, right? And I'm guilty of it myself sometimes. I actually have personally, part of my own striving to be a better human is, I've said my phone is away from me during certain times, like during dinner and other times when I'm with my kids, because it is so tempting to look at it. So, but also this is being driven, we should say that the main drivers here. One is teachers who are just see kids distracted and not paying attention, and mental health. There is it is not good for kids to be on their phones, and often they're looking at social media. The Surgeon General has warned about a direct connection between mental health issues of teenagers and social media. And so the phone is the delivery device.
I can remember in 2018 going to a high school that was one of the early to ban phones at school. And at the beginning of the school day, the homeroom teacher would collect the phones. He put out a plastic bucket and you're supposed to drop your phone in there. And I remember I said at lunch to one of the kids, "Do you miss your phone during the day?" And he said, "No, of course not." And he whipped it out for me. And I said, "Well, wait a minute, didn't you drop it in the bucket?" And he told me that most of his friends and himself would hand in a bricked phone. So kids are going to find workaround. I guess what I'm saying is if kids really want access to that technology, some of them are going to find a workaround.
So, yes, it is possible to break the rules. There's no question. I think part of this, though, also depends on the culture of the school. And if you have a place where it really, the expectation is that people don't have their phones, as opposed to the expectation is that we're all working around it, then that tends to have a positive effect on others too. There are some teachers who say that they suspect that there are a lot of kids who say they want them, but actually are secretly relieved when they don't have them. Obviously, if you have kids who need special accommodations for various reasons, that's another matter. That's a little less acute in districts that provide devices. So, if you have a district provided laptop with you, then they can control what websites you're able to access. That obviously mitigates those problems to some extent, but there always will be case by case situations.
I think this is fascinating. And I would encourage education reporters, if you can, do some kind of an informal survey of teachers of maybe how they feel about technology in the classroom or how much they think it's interfering, and then check with them again at the end of the academic year. I mean, we're not going to know right away whether these bans are, quote unquote, successful. And it will also be difficult to sort of parse out if they have a direct effect on things like attendance or grades. And some of this, isn't it, Laura, just going to be sort of a sense of what the school community feels like and how students and parents and teachers feel about what's happened.
Yeah, I don't think this is there's going to be like hard evidence at the end of a year that like, wow, our test scores went up 20% with this. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to be much more a vibe than anything. But yeah, I think that one thing you can do if you're covering this in your community is you can put out a call out in the paper or online to look for people to contact you with their views on this or their stories. A lot of people want to talk about this. This is pushing on an open door to get people both who support it and oppose it to tell you why. It also would be interesting if you're in an area with multiple districts. Do the policies differ or do they tend to be the same? How do they deal with the various barriers that come along? And also like just what's the school climate? Does it change once you put these policies into place?
The cell phone ban story took some folks by surprise. There's a story that we knew was coming, and it's just as consequential, and I would argue even more so. And that is, of course, the ESSER funds have run out. That was the funding from the federal government intended to help districts make it through the pandemic and also improve student achievement and accountability along the way. What do reporters need to know, Laura?
Yeah, well, this is a story that is definitely, I would say, more important, not as likely to get people sort of chatting on the playground or in the group chat about. This is a much wonkier story, but an important one. There was a huge amount of money made available by the federal government to school districts to deal with the pandemic. Initially, the real issue was about reopening schools, but it quickly became about recovery. And the schools have until this year to spend it. I think the deadline got extended a little bit longer, like into the rest of this year that they have to use the money, but it is clearly running/run out. So a definite question for your school districts is how they have dealt with that. I don't pretend to have a bird's eye view on what's happening everywhere, but I have anecdotally talked to districts that have done a wide range of things. There's some that are just having to make cuts because of it. There are some that have found the money elsewhere. And there's some that use the money for one-time expenses because they saw this cliff coming.
One thing to also check on is, were there any funds that went unexpended and that were not drawn down? Why did that happen? How much was left on the table?
Yeah, I mean, if there's no excuse for a district not using all of their money, I would say. So if that was the case, that would be a good story.
We're talking with the Washington Post's Laura Meckler about her top story ideas for the new school year. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. Take a moment and subscribe. Please also take a moment to go over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. Laura, I want to talk about another story of yours, and that is the culture wars. And you said to me, are they raging? Were they ever? So what's the answer? Are they raging now, Laura? And were they ever?
Well, certainly in certain parts of the country, they were, no question, were they raging. I mean, you have lots of school districts where school board meetings were in fuego, where you have legislation coming down from the legislature restricting what can be taught, how it can be talked about. So there's no question that books have been removed from libraries. I mean, all of this stuff has been pretty well documented. One of my questions going into the school year is like, to what extent does that still have fire behind it? Are we still seeing seeing more of this, or are we seeing any loosening of that? Are things calming down a little bit? And if so, why? Are the folks who were behind that just kind of feel like they won? Are they moving on to other things? I think it's just these are questions.
I think you have to obviously connect that to another big story, and that is, of course, the election cycle, which is who's running for school boards and why, what are they pledging or promising to either do or to undo. And I do feel like some folks are a little bit of a holding pattern right now, waiting to see what happens with some of the threats of so-called takeovers by conservative voting blocs who believe that districts have gone astray in what they're expecting teachers to do in the classroom or what they're allowing children to see and learn.
Well, the school board elections for states that have school boards races this year is always something worth watching. It's very hard to get your hands on that nationally, although we have tried a few times. But it's a very easy story to do locally to see. Everything depends on the context. So if you're if you're an area where you've had a lot of these school board battles, do you have as many as you used to? Are any of those school boards flipping back away from a conservative majority? Just sort of what is the lay of the land locally? I think that that's definitely worth looking at. On the flip side, are there places that never saw this before and now you're seeing it? I mean, that would be interesting if that happens. Write about it, and please send me a link because I'd love to see it. I think that's another good question. Sort of just where are we in that in terms of have things become a little more stable? And then a corollary to that would be in places that did have a school board power change where conservatives took control. What did they do with that power? And, what have the results been?
That's a great suggestion to look at what was the actual implications of the last cycle. I think that's terrific. Also, looking back to the last cycle, take a look and see how many votes were cast for school board and also find out where the school board races appear on the ballot. In a lot of places, they're at the very back of the ballot. Sometimes those ballots are many, 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 many pages of confusing ballot measures and questions and candidates and judges. And in a lot of places, including Las Vegas, where, as loyal listeners know, I spent almost a decade covering public schools, who decides who has the purse strings on a $2 billion school budget is sometimes decided by a couple thousand people, which can be rather remarkable.
Absolutely. I think that it's really important to cover the elections, but also really important to cover what happens once those elections are over.
We do want reporters also to be thinking about issues related to school choice as they head into the new academic year. Why are school vouchers a big story, Laura?
School vouchers are just an incredibly important story happening. They are growing in states all over the country, conservative states all over the country, I should say. And, there are all sorts of ways for using public money to support private education, sometimes including homeschooling. So through voucher programs, or sometimes what's called educational savings accounts. The numbers used to be relatively small. These programs used to be somewhat targeted, either targeted to low income students, targeted to students in school districts that were perceived to be failing, targeted to students with disabilities. This is how this typically looked. But now these programs are increasingly being offered to any student who wants it, including students who are already in private schools, and they can tap this money. So I think there are important stories to be mined about what are the implications for school districts if they're losing students, what are the implications for the state budget if they're essentially giving money to people who were not being funded before in any way, what are the implications for the families, people who choose to use this money, and obviously what are the implications for the kids. So there's just a lot to mine there in terms of school vouchers. I don't think this is going to go away. I think that we're likely to see more states embrace this or expand their programs. I mean, I did a big story a few months ago looking at the rise of vouchers, and I looked at specifically what percent of them were going to religious schools. And, the answer was a overwhelming percentage of the money is going to religious schools. But as part of that, I really got my hands around kind of what the numbers are. And in some states like Ohio, maybe last fiscal year now, was projected to spend $1 billion on vouchers. In Florida, it was more than $3 billion. And there are about 5 or 6 states that have these big programs that are open to anybody that have already got huge numbers enrolled. But there are others just coming up behind that.
These are really important topics. Would encourage listeners to be thinking about of the students who get the vouchers, make sure you ask for the numbers of the students who are already in a private or parochial school who's taking advantage of a voucher, as opposed to those who may be, quote unquote, fleeing or leaving a traditional public school to go into a private program. Those are pretty important numbers to have.
Yes, definitely. And those are more easily gathered on the local or on the state level, and they're worth looking at for sure.
Laura, for some reporters who have been on the beat for a long time, like you have, back to school season can start to feel a little bit stale, but you seem pretty energized about it. How do you keep that enthusiasm up?
Well, I'm glad to hear that I sound that way. Well, the stories always change. For me, I don't really view this as, oh, it's back to school. Let's go do a back to school story. It's really like what's exciting me now. So the stories that I'm working on, I find, really interesting. And, I just did a story reconstructing President Trump's 1776 commission and how that came to be. And that was, and how it executed its mission and the role it played in sparking the culture wars. And, that was something that hadn't been looked at before. And is it a back to school story? I don't know, but it was an interesting political story for sure. That, was super interesting to me. And I'm working on stories that I find compelling. So it always changes. For me, this is a beat. One thing that I love about this beat is that it really is about so many different types of things. And it's a lot of different issues find their way into the conversation through schools. So there's a way to write about a wide swath of sort of debate and culture in America.
I say all the time that every story is an education story. So maybe this time we can say every story is a back to school story. How about that?
There you go. It's all story. Just put at the beginning, as students go back to school, comma, and there you go. It's a back to school story.
Laura Meckler is an award-winning journalist and multiple-time finalist for Best Beat Reporter in the Nation from the National Awards from Education Reporting. She covers the national education beat for the Washington Post. Laura is also the author of the recent book Dreamtown, Shaker Heights and the Quest for Racial Equity. She grew up in Shaker Heights, Ohio, and she went back to try to answer the question of how far good intentions could really take a community that was trying to close racial gaps on educational opportunities and outcomes. It is a beautiful story, meticulously reported and well told. Laura, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 77 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.